There were men in Rome who stood closer to the emperor than his own family. They wore polished armor. They carried sharp swords. They slept in barracks near the palace walls. And they decided, more than once, who would live and who would die. These were the Praetorian Guard. You're listening to Archive of Rest, a place for slow history and quiet nights. Tonight, we're going to talk about power. Not the kind that comes from armies in distant lands or senators arguing in marble halls. This is the power that lives in shadows, the kind that waits behind closed doors, the kind that whispers. The Praetorian Guard began as protectors. They were supposed to keep the emperor safe, but over time, something changed. They became the ones emperors feared most. Imagine Rome at night. The streets are empty. Torches flicker along the stone walls. Inside the palace, an emperor sits alone. He knows that outside his door, armed men are standing watch. He knows their names. He pays them well. But he does not know if they are loyal. This is the world we're entering tonight. The Praetorian Guard was not like other soldiers. Regular legions fought on the frontiers. They marched through forests and deserts. They built roads and conquered cities. But the Praetorians stayed in Rome. They lived in comfort. They earned more money. They served fewer years. And they had access. Access to the emperor. Access to his family. Access to the rooms where decisions were made. They heard things. They saw things. And eventually, they realized something important. They were the ones holding the swords. For nearly 300 years, the Praetorian Guard shaped the fate of Rome. They made emperors. They unmade them. They sold the throne to the highest bidder. They killed men who trusted them. But they did not start that way. In the beginning, they were loyal. They were disciplined. They were proud to serve. Augustus, the first emperor, created them. He needed protection. He needed men he could trust. And for a while, it worked. But trust is a fragile thing. Over the decades, the Praetorians grew more powerful. They realized that emperors needed them more than they needed emperors. And once that realization took hold, everything changed. This is not a story about battles. There are no great speeches here. No triumphant marches. This is a story about what happens when the people meant to protect you become the ones you fear. It's a story about money and ambition, about loyalty that could be bought, about men who stood in the center of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, and decided they wanted more. We'll walk through their history slowly. We'll see how they lived, how they trained, how they were paid. We'll watch as they began to interfere in politics. We'll stand in the room when they turned on their emperors. We'll witness the moment they auctioned the empire itself. And we'll see how it all came to an end. But tonight, there's no rush. The story will unfold gently. You can close your eyes. You can listen. You can let the words wash over you. If you drift off, that's fine. The Praetorian Guard will still be here when you wake, because their story has waited 2,000 years. It can wait a little longer. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the weight of the day fall away. We're going back to Rome, to a time when power was personal, when danger wore a uniform, when the men who were supposed to guard the throne became the ones who controlled it. This is the story of the Praetorian Guard. And it begins, as so many things in Rome did, with one man's need for safety. Augustus did not trust easily. He had seen what happened to men who did. His great-uncle, Julius Caesar, had trusted the Senate. He had walked into their chamber without fear, and they had killed him for it. Augustus learned from that. When he became the first emperor of Rome, he knew he needed protection. Not just soldiers standing at a distance. He needed men close, men who would stay by his side, men who would watch the doors while he slept. So he created the Praetorian Guard. The name came from an old Roman tradition. Generals in the field had always kept a special group of soldiers near their command tent, which was called the Praetorium. These men were chosen carefully. They were loyal. They were skilled. They protected the general while he made decisions. Augustus took that idea and brought it to Rome. In the year 27 BCE, he formed 9 cohorts of elite soldiers. Each cohort had about 500 men. They were not like the legions that fought in Gaul or Germania. These men would stay in the city. They would guard the emperor and his family. They would keep watch over the heart of the empire. At first, they did not even have a permanent camp. They were scattered throughout Rome, staying in different locations. Augustus wanted them close, but not too visible. He did not want the people of Rome to feel like they were living under military rule, because Rome, officially, was still a republic. Augustus was careful about that. He never called himself a king. He never wore a crown. He presented himself as the first citizen, the princeps. He said he was restoring the republic, not replacing it. But he still needed guards. The early Praetorians were different from what they would become. They were disciplined. They were respectful. They did their job quietly. They stood outside the emperor's residence. They accompanied him through the streets. They made sure no one got too close, and they were paid well for it. A Praetorian earned more than a regular legionary. The difference was significant. A soldier in the legions might earn 225 denarii a year. A Praetorian earned 750. That was more than 3 times as much. Augustus knew what he was doing. He was buying loyalty. He was making sure these men had something to lose. If they protected him, they would live comfortably. If they failed, they would lose everything. For a while, it worked. The Praetorians under Augustus were loyal. They did not interfere in politics. They did not make demands. They simply did their job. They were the emperor's shadow, always present but rarely noticed. Augustus also chose their commanders carefully. He appointed 2 Praetorian prefects, men of equestrian rank. They were not senators. They were not from the old aristocratic families. They owed their position entirely to the emperor. This was intentional. Augustus did not want his guards answering to anyone but him. He did not want them forming alliances with powerful senators. He wanted their loyalty to be personal, direct, and absolute. And for the 20 years of his reign after creating the Guard, that's what he got. But Augustus was the first emperor. He had the authority of a founder. He had defeated Mark Antony. He had brought peace after decades of civil war. People respected him. They feared him. They needed him. The emperors who came after him would not have the same advantage. When Augustus died in 14 CE, the Praetorian Guard faced a choice. They had sworn loyalty to one man. That man was gone. Now there was another man, Tiberius, who claimed the throne. Would they accept him? They did. But the fact that the question even existed was significant. The Praetorians had the power to say no. They had the swords. They had the position. If they had refused to recognize Tiberius, the transition of power would have been very different. Tiberius understood this. He made sure the Praetorians were paid. He made sure they were honored. He did not take their loyalty for granted, and he made one change that would shape everything that followed. In 23 CE, Tiberius allowed his Praetorian prefect, a man named Sejanus, to build a permanent camp for the guard. It was called the Castra Praetoria. It was located on the outskirts of Rome, near the city walls. For the first time, the Praetorian Guard had a home. The camp was large. It had barracks, training grounds, storage facilities, and administrative buildings. It could house all 9 cohorts in one place. The walls were strong. The gates were guarded. It looked like a military fortress, because that's what it was. And now, instead of being scattered and invisible, the Praetorians were concentrated. They were organized. They were a visible force inside the city of Rome. This changed things. A scattered guard is just a collection of bodyguards. A unified guard, living together, training together, eating together, is something else. It's a unit. It has identity. It has strength. And it has opinions. The Praetorians began to see themselves as special. They were not just soldiers. They were the emperor's chosen men. They lived in the capital. They wore finer armor. They had better food. They had shorter terms of service. While a legionary served for 25 years, a Praetorian served for 16. They were elite, and they knew it. But with that sense of identity came something else, a sense of entitlement, a belief that they deserved their privileges, and eventually a belief that they had a say in how the empire was run. It did not happen all at once. Under Tiberius, the Praetorians remained mostly loyal. There were tensions. There were moments when their prefect, Sejanus, seemed to have too much power. But the structure held. When Tiberius died and Caligula became emperor, the Praetorians accepted the transition. When Caligula was assassinated and Claudius took the throne, the Praetorians were the ones who found him, hiding behind a curtain, and declared him emperor. That moment mattered. It was the first time the Praetorian Guard actively chose an emperor. They did not just protect the man in power, they decided who that man would be. Claudius rewarded them. He gave each Praetorian a bonus of 15,000 sesterces. It was an enormous sum. It was also a precedent. From that point on, every new emperor would have to pay the Praetorians to secure their loyalty. The guards had learned something important. They had learned that emperors needed them, and that need could be expensive. But in these early years, the system still worked. The Praetorians were still, mostly, what they were supposed to be. They were protectors. They were enforcers. They kept order. They had not yet become kingmakers. That would come later. For now, they stood at their posts. They patrolled the streets. They watched the palace doors. They collected their pay. And they waited. Because in Rome, patience was often rewarded. And the Praetorian Guard was learning to be very patient. The Castra Praetoria sat on the northeastern edge of Rome, just inside the city walls. It was not a beautiful place. It was functional. Stone walls, iron gates, rows of barracks built in straight lines. Everything was designed for order and efficiency. This was where the Praetorians lived when they were not on duty. This was their world. Inside the camp, life followed a rhythm. There were routines, there were rules, but there was also comfort. More comfort than most soldiers ever knew. A Praetorian's day began early. Before dawn, the men would wake in their barracks. Each cohort had its own building. The rooms were simple, but not cramped. A Praetorian had his own bed, his own space. He did not sleep on the ground like soldiers in the field. After waking, there was inspection. Armor had to be polished. Weapons had to be sharp. A Praetorian was expected to look the part. He represented the emperor. He could not appear sloppy or weak. Then came training. Even though the Aetai Praetorians rarely fought in actual battles, they trained as if they would. They drilled with swords and shields. They practiced formations. They ran through combat exercises. But their training was different from what legionaries did on the frontier. Legionaries trained for war. They learned to march long distances. They learned to build camps quickly. They learned to fight in open fields against enemy armies. Praetorians trained for something else. They trained for close combat, for fighting in tight spaces, for protecting a single person in a crowd, for moving through streets and buildings. They were not preparing to conquer Gaul. They were preparing to stop an assassin. Their weapons reflected this. A Praetorian carried a gladius, the short Roman sword. It was perfect for close quarters. He also carried a dagger. Some carried small shields. Their armor was lighter than what legionaries wore on campaign. They needed to move quickly. They needed to react fast. Because in their line of work, hesitation meant death. Not their death usually, the emperor's death. After morning training, there was food. The Praetorians ate well, better than regular soldiers. They had access to fresh bread, meat, wine, and vegetables. The emperor made sure of it. A hungry guard is a resentful guard, and resentment, in men who carry swords, is dangerous. So the Praetorians were fed. They were paid. They were given privileges that other soldiers could only dream of. They could marry. Legionaries were not officially allowed to marry while in service, though many did anyway. But for Praetorians, it was permitted. They could have families. They could own property in Rome. They were also allowed to live outside the camp when off duty. Many Praetorians had homes in the city. They walked the same streets as senators and merchants. They drank in the same taverns. They were part of Roman society in a way that frontier soldiers never were. This created a strange dynamic. The Praetorians were soldiers, but they were also citizens of Rome. They had roots in the city. They had connections. They heard gossip. They knew what people were saying about the emperor, and sometimes they agreed with it. When they were on duty, Praetorians rotated through different assignments. Some guarded the palace. Some escorted the emperor when he traveled through the city. Some stood watch at important government buildings. The palace guard was the most prestigious assignment. These men stood outside the emperor's private chambers. They saw who came and went. They heard conversations through doors. They knew secrets. And secrets in Rome were currency. A Praetorian who knew something valuable could use that knowledge. He could share it with his prefect. He could share it with a senator. He could keep it to himself and wait for the right moment. Information was power, and the Praetorians had access to more information than almost anyone. But most of the time, their work was boring. They stood, they watched, they waited. Hours passed slowly. Nothing happened. Then more nothing. Then their shift ended, and they went back to the barracks. This was the reality of being a Praetorian. Long stretches of tedium interrupted by brief moments of tension. But those moments mattered. When there was a threat, the Praetorians moved fast. They surrounded the emperor. They cleared the area. They identified the danger and eliminated it. They were good at their job. They had to be. An emperor who died on their watch meant punishment. It meant disgrace. It meant losing everything they had worked for. So they stayed alert. They stayed ready. But over time, something shifted. The Praetorians began to realize that they were not just protecting the emperor. They were also controlling access to him. If someone wanted to speak to the emperor, they had to get past the Praetorians. If someone wanted to deliver a message, the Praetorians saw it first. If someone wanted to plot against the emperor, they had to do it quietly, because the Praetorians were always listening. This gave them influence. Subtle influence at first, but influence nonetheless. A Praetorian could delay a message. He could forget to pass along a request. He could mention to his prefect that a certain senator had been asking too many questions. These small actions added up. The Praetorian prefects, the commanders of the guard, had even more power. They met with the emperor regularly. They advised him on security matters. They controlled the schedules. They decided which Praetorians were assigned to which posts. A prefect who wanted to could isolate an emperor. He could surround him with loyal men. He could filter what information reached him. He could make the emperor dependent on him. This happened more than once. Sejanus, the prefect under Tiberius, did exactly this. He convinced Tiberius to leave Rome and retire to the island of Capri. With the emperor gone, Sejanus ran the city. He controlled the Praetorians. He arrested his enemies. He accumulated power. Eventually, Tiberius realized what was happening and had Sejanus executed. But the damage was done. The precedent was set. A Praetorian prefect could be more powerful than anyone except the emperor himself, and sometimes he could be more powerful than the emperor too. Back in the barracks, ordinary Praetorians talked about these things. They were not stupid. They understood the game being played. They saw how their prefects maneuvered. They saw how emperors rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. They learned. And they began to think about their own interests. Why should they risk their lives for an emperor who might be gone tomorrow? Why should they stay loyal to a man who treated them poorly? Why should they accept whatever they were given when they had the power to demand more? These questions did not have easy answers, but they were being asked. In the evenings, after duty, Praetorians would gather in the camp. They would drink. They would talk. They would complain about their officers, about the emperor, about the state of things. This was normal. Soldiers always complain. But when the soldiers doing the complaining are the ones guarding the most powerful man in the world, their complaints matter. A rumor could spread through the barracks in hours. A grievance could turn into anger. Anger could turn into action. The emperors knew this. They tried to keep the Praetorians happy. They gave bonuses. They held ceremonies. They praised the guard publicly. But it was never enough. Because once men realize they have power, they want more of it. And the Praetorians were starting to realize just how much power they had. They were not there yet. Not in these early decades. They were still mostly loyal, still mostly professional. But the seeds were planted. In the barracks of the Castra Praetoria, in the quiet conversations between guards, in the calculations of ambitious prefects, something was growing. It would take time. It would take the right circumstances. It would take emperors who were weak or cruel or foolish. But eventually, the Praetorian Guard would stop being protectors, and they would become something much more dangerous. Money changed everything. In the beginning, the Praetorians were paid well because Augustus wanted loyal guards. It was a practical decision, a simple transaction, service for coin. But over time, that transaction became something else. It became an expectation, then a demand, then a weapon. The Praetorians learned that their loyalty had a price, and they learned that emperors would pay it. A regular legionary stationed on the frontier earned about 225 denarii per year. It was enough to live on, enough to save a little, but not enough to become wealthy. A Praetorian earned 750 denarii per year. That was the base pay. But there was more. When a new emperor took power, he gave the Praetorians a donative, a bonus, a gift to secure their loyalty. Claudius, when the Praetorians found him hiding after Caligula's assassination and declared him emperor, gave each guard 15,000 sesterces. That was roughly 3 years of pay, all at once. It was an enormous sum, and it set a precedent that would haunt every emperor who came after. From that moment on, the Praetorians expected to be paid when power changed hands. They expected to be rewarded for their loyalty. And if the reward was not generous enough, their loyalty became uncertain. This created a dangerous cycle. An emperor who wanted to stay in power had to keep the Praetorians happy. That meant paying them regularly, giving bonuses, providing privileges. If he failed to do this, the Praetorians might decide they preferred someone else, someone who would pay more. The Praetorians also served shorter terms than regular soldiers. A legionary served for 25 years before he could retire. A Praetorian served for 16. This meant a Praetorian could join at age 18 and retire at 34. He would still be young, still strong, and he would have accumulated significant wealth. When a Praetorian retired, he received a discharge bonus. Land, sometimes. Money, always. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. This was the promise. Serve well, stay loyal, and you will be taken care of. And for many Praetorians, it worked exactly as promised. They served their 16 years. They collected their pay. They retired to a small farm or a house in the city. They lived quietly. But not all of them. Some Praetorians wanted more. They saw the wealth of senators. They saw the power of prefects. They saw how much money flowed through Rome, and they wanted their share. These men were dangerous, not because they were disloyal by nature, but because their loyalty could be bought. And if someone offered them more than the emperor did, they would listen. The emperors understood this. They tried to stay ahead of it. They increased pay. They gave gifts. They held games and festivals in honor of the guard. Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 CE, was particularly generous. He gave the Praetorians multiple bonuses during his reign. He wanted them on his side because he knew how unpopular he was becoming. It worked for a while. But money alone could not buy loyalty forever. Eventually, the Praetorians began to ask themselves a question. If the emperor needs us more than we need him, why are we taking orders? This question did not lead to immediate rebellion. It was more subtle than that. It led to a shift in attitude, a sense that the relationship between emperor and guard was not what it appeared to be. The emperor was not the master. He was the employer. And if he failed to pay well, he could be replaced. This became clear during the year of the 4 emperors in 68 and 69 CE. Nero lost the support of the legions. He lost the support of the Senate. And eventually, he lost the support of the Praetorians. When it became clear that he would be overthrown, the Praetorians did not defend him. They stepped aside. Nero fled. He killed himself before he could be captured. The Praetorians had not killed him directly, but they had allowed him to fall, and that was almost the same thing. After Nero, there was chaos. 4 men claimed the throne in quick succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian. Each one needed the Praetorians. Each one tried to buy their loyalty. Galba made a mistake. He refused to pay the donative that the Praetorians expected. He said the treasury was empty. He said he could not afford it. The Praetorians did not accept this. They had been promised payment. They expected payment. And when Galba refused, they turned on him. They killed him in the forum, in broad daylight, in front of everyone. Then they declared Otho emperor, because Otho had promised to pay them. Otho gave each Praetorian 2,500 denarii. It was a fortune, and it bought him their loyalty for 3 months. Then Otho lost a battle against Vitellius, another claimant to the throne. Otho killed himself. The Praetorians switched sides. Vitellius paid them. He gave bonuses. He promised more. The Praetorians accepted him as emperor for 8 months. Then Vespasian's legions marched on Rome. They defeated Vitellius. The Praetorians, seeing which way the wind was blowing, did not fight very hard to defend him. Vitellius was killed. Vespasian became emperor, and the Praetorians once again accepted the new ruler, because Vespasian paid them. This pattern revealed something important. The Praetorians were not ideological. They did not care about politics or principles. They cared about money and security. Whoever could provide those things would have their loyalty. Whoever could not would lose it. Vespasian understood this. He was a practical man. He had been a general. He knew how soldiers thought. He paid the Praetorians well. He gave them bonuses. He honored them publicly. And in return, they supported him. They supported his sons after him. The Flavian dynasty remained stable, in part, because they kept the Praetorians satisfied. But the cost was high. The imperial treasury was constantly strained by the need to pay the guard. Money that could have been spent on infrastructure, on the legions, on the provinces, went instead to keeping 9,000 men happy. And those 9,000 men were not even fighting. They were not defending the borders. They were not conquering new territory. They were just standing around Rome, collecting pay. Some emperors resented this. They saw the Praetorians as parasites, as extortionists. But they could not get rid of them, because an emperor without the Praetorians was an emperor who would not last long. There were moments when emperors tried to reduce the guard's power. They appointed new prefects. They shuffled cohorts. They withheld bonuses. These efforts rarely ended well. The Praetorians had learned that they were essential. They had learned that emperors needed them more than they needed any particular emperor. And they had learned that if they were unhappy, they could make their displeasure known, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, sometimes with swords. The price of protection kept rising. Each new emperor had to pay more than the last. Each donative had to be larger. Each bonus had to be more generous. It was unsustainable. Everyone knew it. But no one could stop it. Because stopping it would require an emperor strong enough to face down the Praetorians. And any emperor strong enough to do that would not need the Praetorians in the first place. So the cycle continued. The Praetorians stood at their posts. They collected their pay. They waited for the next emperor, and they calculated how much he would be worth to them. In the barracks, they talked about money constantly. Who had received what bonus? Who had been promoted? Who had been given a better assignment? They compared themselves to the legions. They noted with satisfaction that they earned more, that they lived better, that they had it easier. But they also compared themselves to senators, to wealthy merchants, to imperial freedmen who had become rich through proximity to power. and they realized that despite all their privileges, they were still just soldiers. They were still taking orders. They were still dependent on someone else's generosity. Some of them wanted more than that. They wanted to be the ones giving orders. They wanted to be the ones deciding who ruled. They wanted to stop being the emperor's servants and become his masters. That transformation was already beginning, slowly, quietly, in small decisions and subtle shifts of power. The Praetorians were learning that loyalty was a commodity, and like any commodity, it could be sold to the highest bidder. The emperors had taught them this, by paying them, by rewarding them, by making them essential. Now the Praetorians would teach the emperors a lesson in return. They would teach them what happens when the guards realize they are more powerful than the man they are guarding. The first time it happened, it seemed like an accident. Caligula was dead, assassinated by members of his own guard in 41 CE. The conspirators had struck quickly in a corridor beneath the palace. Swords flashed. The emperor fell. And then there was silence. No one had planned what would come next. The assassins had wanted Caligula gone, but they had not thought about who would replace him. The Senate began to debate. Some senators spoke of restoring the Republic, of ending the imperial system entirely. It was a fantasy, but for a few hours it seemed possible. Then the Praetorians found Claudius. He was hiding behind a curtain in the palace. He was terrified. He thought the guards had come to kill him too. He was Caligula's uncle, part of the imperial family. He assumed he would be next. But the Praetorians had a different idea. They needed an emperor. Without one, there would be chaos. Without one, they might not get paid. So, when they found Claudius cowering in fear, they made a decision. They declared him emperor. They did not ask the Senate. They did not consult the people. They simply decided. And because they had the swords, their decision mattered. Claudius was carried to the Praetorian camp. He was proclaimed emperor there, inside the barracks, surrounded by armed men. The Senate, still debating in the forum, learned about it afterward. They were furious. But there was nothing they could do. The Praetorians had chosen, and Claudius, grateful to be alive, rewarded them generously. 15,000 sesterces per man, a fortune. This moment changed everything. Before this, emperors had been chosen by inheritance, by adoption, or by acclamation of the legions and senate. The Praetorians had protected emperors, but they had not made them. Now they had. And once they realized they could do it, they began to think about doing it again. Claudius ruled for 13 years. He was not a strong emperor, but he was competent. He kept the Praetorians paid. He kept them loyal. When he died in 54 CE, possibly poisoned, the succession went smoothly. Nero became emperor. He was young. He was Claudius's adopted son. The Praetorians accepted him without question, because Nero paid them. But Nero's reign did not go well. He was erratic. He was cruel. He killed his own mother. He killed his wife. He spent money recklessly. He performed on stage, which Romans found humiliating for an emperor. The Senate hated him. The people grew tired of him. And eventually, the legions turned against him. When the governor of Hispania, a man named Galba, declared himself emperor and marched on Rome, Nero panicked. He looked to the Praetorians for support. They were not there. The Praetorian prefect at the time was a man named Nymphidius Sabinus. He had his own ambitions. He saw that Nero was finished. So he made a deal with Galba. He promised to deliver the Praetorians to Galba's side. In exchange, Galba would pay each Praetorian 7,500 denarii, an enormous sum. The Praetorians agreed. They abandoned Nero, and Nero, realizing he had no one left, fled the city and killed himself. Galba became emperor, but he made a fatal mistake. When he arrived in Rome, he refused to pay the donative that Nymphidius had promised. He said the treasury could not afford it. He said he recruited soldiers. He did not buy them. It was a principled stance. It was also a death sentence. The Praetorians were enraged. They had been promised payment. They had betrayed their emperor for that payment. And now they were being told they would not receive it. They did not accept this quietly. Nymphidius tried to use their anger to make himself emperor. He told the Praetorians that he was the illegitimate son of Caligula, that he had a claim to the throne. He asked them to support him. They killed him instead. The Praetorians did not want Nymphidius, but they did not want Galba either. They wanted someone who would pay them. That someone was Otho. Otho was a senator. He had been a friend of Nero. He was ambitious and wealthy, and he made the Praetorians an offer. "Support me, and I will give you what Galba promised." The Praetorians agreed. On January 15, 69 CE, they murdered Galba in the Roman Forum. They hacked him to pieces in front of a crowd. Then they proclaimed Otho emperor. Otho paid them 2,500 denarii each. He kept his promise. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months. The legions in Germania had proclaimed their own emperor, Vitellius. The two armies met in battle. Otho lost. Rather than continue the civil war, he killed himself. The Praetorians once again switched sides. Vitellius entered Rome. He disbanded Otho's Praetorians and replaced them with his own men, drawn from the German legions. These new Praetorians were loyal to Vitellius. They had fought for him. They expected to be rewarded, and they were, for a while. But then Vespasian, a general in the east, declared himself emperor. His legions marched on Rome. They defeated Vitellius's forces. They stormed the city. The Praetorians fought, but not very hard. They could see that Vitellius was losing. They could see that Vespasian would win, and they knew that the winning side would need guards, so they fought just enough to avoid being called cowards. Then they surrendered. Vitellius was killed. Vespasian became emperor, and the Praetorians once again accepted the new ruler, because Vespasian paid them. This pattern, repeated over the course of one terrible year, revealed the truth about the Praetorian Guard. They were not loyal to Rome. They were not loyal to the imperial family. They were not even loyal to the idea of the empire. They were loyal to whoever paid them, and they had learned that they could choose who that person would be. Vespasian understood this. He was a practical man. He had spent his career in the legions. He knew how soldiers thought. He knew what motivated them. So he paid the Praetorians well. He gave them bonuses. He honored them. And in return, they supported him. They supported his sons, Titus and Domitian, after him. The Flavian dynasty lasted for 27 years. It was a period of relative stability. The Praetorians did not make or unmake emperors during this time, but the precedent had been set. The Praetorians now knew that they had the power to choose. They knew that emperors needed their approval. They knew that their loyalty was the most valuable commodity in Rome. And they knew that if an emperor displeased them, they could find another. This knowledge changed the relationship between emperor and guard. It was no longer a simple hierarchy. It was a negotiation, a transaction, a balance of power that could shift at any moment. Emperors had to be careful. They had to watch what they said around the Praetorians. They had to make sure the guards were happy. They had to avoid giving them reasons to look. elsewhere. Some emperors managed this well. They were generous. They were respectful. They treated the Praetorians as partners, not servants. Other emperors were not so wise. Domitian, the last of the Flavian emperors, became paranoid in his final years. He trusted no one. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He executed senators. He purged his court, and he made the Praetorians nervous. Nervous guards are dangerous guards. In 96 CE, Domitian was assassinated. The conspiracy involved members of his household, court officials, and possibly some Praetorians. The details are unclear, but what is clear is that the Praetorians did not stop it. They could have. They were supposed to. That was their job. But they chose not to. After Domitian's death, the Senate quickly proclaimed Nerva as emperor. Nerva was old. He was safe. He was not a threat to anyone. The Praetorians accepted him, but they also made demands. They wanted the men who had killed Domitian to be punished. Not because they loved Domitian, but because they wanted to assert their authority. Nerva had to comply. He handed over the assassins. The Praetorians executed them. This was a message. The Praetorians were saying that they decided who lived and who died. Not the Senate, not the emperor. Them. Nerva ruled for only 16 months. He adopted Trajan, a popular general, as his successor. When Nerva died, Trajan became emperor smoothly. Trajan was strong. He was respected by the legions. He was a successful military commander. The Praetorians did not challenge him, but they were watching. Always watching. They had learned that emperors were not permanent. They had learned that power could change hands quickly. They had learned that they were the ones who controlled the transition, and they were waiting for the next opportunity to prove it. That opportunity would come. Not immediately, but eventually. Because in Rome, nothing stayed stable for long. And the Praetorians had become very good at recognizing when stability was about to break. The palace was never truly safe. An emperor could have walls. He could have locks. He could have guards at every door. But he could not escape the simple truth that the men protecting him were also the men who could kill him. And sometimes they did. Caligula was the first emperor murdered by his own Praetorians. It happened in 41 CE, in a narrow corridor beneath the palace. He was leaving the theater. He was alone, or nearly alone. The guards who were supposed to protect him turned on him instead. They stabbed him. More than 30 times. They killed his wife. They killed his infant daughter. They wanted to erase him completely. The conspirators had their reasons. Caligula was cruel. He was erratic. He humiliated senators and soldiers alike. He claimed to be a god. He made people worship him. The Praetorians who killed him believed they were doing Rome a favor. Maybe they were right. But their reasons did not matter as much as their actions. They had crossed a line. They had killed the man they were sworn to protect. And once that line was crossed, it could be crossed again. Claudius, who became emperor after Caligula, understood this. He knew the Praetorians had killed his predecessor. He knew they could kill him too, so he paid them. He honored them. He made sure they had no reason to turn on him. It worked. Claudius died in his bed, possibly poisoned by his wife, but not killed by his guards. Nero, who came next, was not so fortunate. He was not assassinated directly by the Praetorians, but they abandoned him when he needed them most. They let him fall. And in Rome, letting someone fall was almost the same as pushing them. After Nero came the chaos of 69 CE. Galba was hacked to pieces by Praetorians in the Forum. Otho killed himself after losing a battle. Vitellius was dragged through the streets and murdered. Violence had become normal, expected even. The Praetorians had learned that emperors were mortal, that they could be removed, that the throne was not sacred. For a while, under the Flavian emperors, things stabilized. Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian all managed to keep the Praetorians loyal. They paid well. They ruled competently. They did not give the guards reasons to plot. But Domitian grew paranoid near the end. He saw enemies everywhere. He executed people on suspicion. He trusted no one. And in 96 CE, he was proven right. There were enemies. They were close. Closer than he thought. He was stabbed to death in his bedroom. The assassins were members of his household, court officials, freedmen, people he saw every day. The Praetorians were nearby. They heard the commotion. They could have intervened. They did not. Whether they were part of the conspiracy or simply chose to look the other way is unclear. But the result was the same. Domitian died, and the Praetorians accepted the next emperor without question. This pattern continued into the 2nd century. Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, became emperor in 180 CE. He was young, he was arrogant, he believed he was Hercules reborn. He fought as a gladiator in the arena, which Romans found shameful for an emperor. He also grew paranoid. He executed senators. He purged his court. He trusted fewer and fewer people. By 192 CE, almost everyone wanted him gone. His advisors, his mistress, his Praetorian prefect. They formed a conspiracy. First, they tried poison. It did not work. Commodus vomited it up, so they sent a wrestler named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. It worked. Commodus died. The Praetorians, who should have been protecting him, were nowhere to be found. Their prefect, Latus, had been part of the plot. The guards had not wielded the weapon, but they had allowed it to happen. They had stepped aside. They had let the emperor die. This was a new kind of assassination. Indirect, passive, but just as effective. After Commodus, the throne went to Pertinax. He was a senator. He was respected. He was competent. He promised to restore order and discipline. The Praetorians did not like him. Pertinax tried to reform the guard. He wanted to reduce their privileges. He wanted to make them more like regular soldiers. He thought this would improve discipline. It was a mistake. The Praetorians did not want discipline. They wanted money. They wanted comfort. They wanted to be special. Pertinax had been emperor for only 86 days when a group of Praetorians marched to the palace. They broke in. They found Pertinax in the throne room. He tried to reason with them. He reminded them of their duty. He appealed to their honor. They killed him anyway. One of them struck him with a sword, then another, then more. Pertinax died on the floor of his own palace, murdered by the men who were supposed to protect him. This was different from Caligula's assassination. Caligula had been killed by a small group of conspirators. Pertinax was killed by a mob of Praetorians. It was not a secret plot, it was open violence. The Praetorians were no longer hiding what they were doing. They were no longer pretending to be loyal. They were asserting their power openly, and they were about to do something even worse. After killing Pertinax, the Praetorians returned to their camp. They locked the gates, and they announced that the throne was for sale. Whoever paid the most could be emperor. This was the logical conclusion of everything that had come before. The Praetorians had been paid to support emperors. They had been paid to switch sides. They had been paid to look the other way. Now they were cutting out the middleman. They were selling the throne directly. 2 men bid for it. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, and Sulpicianus, the father-in-law of the murdered Pertinax. They stood outside the Praetorian camp and shouted their offers. 5,000 denarii per man, 6,000, 7,000. The Praetorians listened. They calculated. They negotiated. Finally, Didius Julianus offered 25,000 sesterces per man. It was an enormous sum, more than most Praetorians would earn in years of service. The Praetorians accepted. They opened the gates. They proclaimed Didius Julianus emperor. He had bought the throne, literally. But he would not keep it for long. The legions in the provinces were outraged. They refused to accept an emperor chosen by bribery. 3 different generals declared themselves emperor. Septimius Severus in Pannonia, Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain. Severus was closest to Rome. He marched his legions toward the city. He sent messages ahead, promising to avenge Pertinax and punish the Praetorians. Didius Julianus panicked. He tried to rally support. He tried to prepare defenses, but no one would help him. The Senate despised him. The people mocked him, and the Praetorians who had sold him the throne were not willing to die for him. When Severus reached Rome, the Praetorians did not fight. They opened the gates. They surrendered. Didius Julianus was executed. He had been emperor for 66 days. Severus entered the city. He summoned the Praetorians to a meeting. He told them to come unarmed, in their dress uniforms. He said he wanted to address them. They obeyed. They gathered in a field outside the city. 9,000 men, standing in formation, waiting to hear what the new emperor would say. Severus surrounded them with his legions. Armed soldiers, loyal to him, formed a ring around the Praetorians. Then Severus spoke. He told them they were a disgrace. He told them they had murdered Pertinax. He told them they had sold the throne like merchants in a market. He told them they were dismissed. The Praetorians were stunned. They protested. They argued. But they were unarmed and surrounded. There was nothing they could do. Severus disbanded the old Praetorian Guard. He sent them away. He replaced them with soldiers from his own legions, men who were loyal to him, men who had fought for him. It seemed like the end of the Praetorians' power. It seemed like an emperor had finally broken them. But it was not the end. Severus had disbanded the old guard, but he had created a new one. And the new Praetorians would learn the same lessons the old ones had. They would learn that emperors needed them. They would learn that loyalty could be bought. They would learn that they had power. And eventually, they would use that power the same way their predecessors had. Because the problem was not the individual Praetorians. The problem was the system. The problem was having armed men, stationed in the capital, with access to the emperor and the ability to make or break his reign. As long as that system existed, the danger would exist too. Emperors would continue to be vulnerable. They would continue to be dependent on men who might betray them. They would continue to sleep uneasily, knowing that the guards outside their door could become their executioners. This was the price of imperial power. This was the cost of ruling Rome, and it would be paid again and again in blood. The year 193 CE should have been ordinary. It was not. It began with an emperor, Commodus, who believed he was a god. It ended with 3 men claiming the throne and the empire tearing itself apart. And in between, the Praetorian Guard did something that had never been done before. They sold the Roman Empire. Not metaphorically, not through backroom deals or quiet negotiations. They literally auctioned it off to the highest bidder. It happened in March, after they had murdered Pertinax. Pertinax had been emperor for less than 3 months. He was a good man, competent, honest. He had tried to restore order after the chaos of Commodus's reign. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had tried to discipline the Praetorians. He wanted them to act like soldiers again. He wanted to reduce their privileges. He wanted to stop paying them bonuses every time they demanded one. The Praetorians did not accept this. They marched to the palace. They broke down the doors. They found Pertinax and killed him. Then they went back to their camp, the Castra Praetoria, and they locked the gates. Inside, they discussed what to do next. They needed a new emperor. But this time, they decided they would choose carefully. They would choose someone who understood the situation, someone who would pay them what they deserved, someone who would pay them a lot. Word spread through Rome that the throne was available, that the Praetorians were willing to negotiate, that the right offer could make a man emperor. 2 men came forward. The first was Sulpicianus. He was the father-in-law of the murdered Pertinax. He was also the urban prefect, one of the highest officials in Rome. He had some claim to legitimacy. He had connections. He had authority. The second was Didius Julianus. He was a wealthy senator. He had held important positions. He had money, a lot of money. Both men went to the Praetorian camp. They stood outside the walls, and they began to bid. It was surreal, undignified, shameful, but it was happening. Sulpicianus offered 5,000 denarii per Praetorian. It was a generous sum, more than a year's pay for each man. The Praetorians considered it, but they did not accept. They wanted more. Didius Julianus, standing nearby, heard the offer. He raised it. 6,000 denarii per man. Sulpicianus countered. 7,000. Back and forth they went, like merchants haggling over grain or wine, except they were haggling over the Roman Empire. The Praetorians watched. They listened. They calculated how much each offer was worth. They were in no hurry. They held all the power. They could afford to wait. Finally, Didius Julianus made his final offer. 25,000 sesterces per man. That was roughly 6,250 denarii, an enormous fortune. The Praetorians accepted. They opened the gates. They brought Didius Julianus inside. They proclaimed him emperor. They swore their loyalty to him, and he paid them every single denarius he had promised. The Senate, when they heard what had happened, was horrified. But they had no choice. They confirmed Didius Julianus as emperor, because the Praetorians had decided, and no one could challenge the Praetorians. Not in Rome, anyway. But outside Rome, in the provinces, the legions were furious. The soldiers who fought on the frontiers, who defended the empire's borders, who lived in camps and marched through mud and snow, they earned a fraction of what the Praetorians made. They served longer. They fought harder. They risked more. And now they were being told that the throne had been sold to the highest bidder by men who did nothing but stand around Rome collecting pay. The legions refused to accept it. In Pannonia, the legions proclaimed their commander, Septimius Severus, as emperor. In Syria, they proclaimed Pescennius Niger. In Britain, they proclaimed Clodius Albinus. 3 rival emperors, 3 armies, and in Rome, a 4th emperor who had bought his throne and had no one to defend it. Didius Julianus tried to prepare. He tried to raise an army. He tried to fortify the city, but he had no support. The Senate despised him. The people mocked him in the streets. Even the Praetorians who had sold him the throne were not willing to die for him. They had been paid. That was all they cared about. Severus marched on Rome. His legions moved quickly, they were disciplined, they were loyal, they were angry. Severus sent messages ahead. He promised to avenge Pertinax. He promised to punish the Praetorians who had murdered him. He promised to restore order. The Senate, seeing which way things were going, turned on Didius Julianus. They declared him a public enemy. They ordered his execution. Didius Julianus, the man who had paid a fortune to become emperor, was killed in his palace. He had ruled for 66 days. The Praetorians did not defend him. They did not even try. They had his money. That was all they wanted. When Severus reached Rome, he did not enter immediately. First, he dealt with the Praetorians. He sent them a message. He told them to assemble outside the city. He told them to come in their dress uniforms, without weapons. He said he wanted to address them as their new emperor. The Praetorians obeyed. They had no reason to suspect anything. They thought Severus would do what every emperor did. He would pay them. He would confirm their privileges. He would move on. They were wrong. 9,000 Praetorians gathered in a field. They stood in formation, unarmed, waiting. Severus arrived with his legions. Armed soldiers surrounded the Praetorians on all sides. There was no escape. Then Severus spoke. His words were harsh. He called them murderers. He called them traitors. He said they had disgraced Rome. He said they had sold the empire like it was a piece of property. He told them they were dismissed. The Praetorians protested. They argued. They said they had only done what emperors had taught them to do. They said they had been paid to be loyal, and they had been loyal to whoever paid them. Severus did not care. He stripped them of their rank. He took their privileges. He sent them away. The old Praetorian Guard was disbanded, destroyed, erased. But Severus did not eliminate the Guard entirely. He could not. He needed protection. He needed men he could trust. So he created a new Praetorian Guard. He filled it with soldiers from his own legions. Men who had fought for him, men who owed him everything. These new Praetorians were different. They were tougher. They were more disciplined. They had seen real combat. They were not soft city soldiers who had spent their careers standing around Rome. For a while, this worked. The new Praetorians were loyal to Severus. They supported him. They helped him defeat his rivals, Niger and Albinus. They helped him secure the throne. But over time, the same patterns emerged. The new Praetorians realized they were essential. They realized the emperor needed them. They realized their loyalty was valuable, and they began to act like the old Praetorians had. They demanded higher pay. They expected bonuses. They grew accustomed to their privileges. Severus paid them. He had no choice. He had seen what happened to emperors who did not keep the Praetorians happy. The auction of 193 CE had been a scandal. It had been shameful. It had shown the world that Rome's throne could be bought. But it had not solved the underlying problem. The problem was that the Praetorians had power. Real power. And as long as they had that power, they would use it. Emperors could disband them. They could replace them. They could punish them. But they could not eliminate the need for guards. And whoever those guards were, they would eventually learn the same lessons. They would learn that emperors were vulnerable, that loyalty could be bought, that the throne was not sacred, and they would act accordingly. The auction of 193 CE was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had been broken from the start. A system where the men who protected the emperor were also the men who could destroy him. A system where power came not from law or tradition, but from whoever held the swords. That system would continue. It would evolve. It would adapt, but it would not change. Not until someone was strong enough to break it completely, and that would take more than a century. The people of Rome lived with a constant awareness. The Praetorians were always there, not always visible, not always in uniform, but always present. Walking the streets, standing in the forum, drinking in the taverns, shopping in the markets. They were part of the city, but they were also apart from it. Everyone knew who they were. You could tell by the way they carried themselves, by the way others moved aside when they passed, by the quiet that fell when they entered a room. The Praetorians were not like other soldiers. Regular legionaries were stationed far away on the frontiers. The people of Rome never saw them. They were abstract, distant. They protected the empire, but they did not intrude on daily life. The Praetorians were different. They lived in Rome. They were neighbors. They were customers. They were part of the fabric of the city. But they were also dangerous. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone had heard what the Praetorians had done, how they had killed emperors, how they had sold the throne, how they had murdered Pertinax in his own palace. And everyone knew that if the Praetorians could kill an emperor, they could kill anyone. This created a strange atmosphere in Rome, a tension that never quite went away. When a Praetorian walked into a shop, the shopkeeper was polite, very polite. He offered the best goods. He did not argue about prices. He did not want trouble. When Praetorians gathered in a tavern, other patrons kept their voices down. They did not complain about the emperor. They did not criticize the government. They did not say anything that might be repeated. Because Praetorians listened. They heard things, and what they heard could be dangerous. A careless word, a joke about the emperor, a complaint about taxes. Any of these could be reported. And once something was reported, there could be consequences. Arrests, interrogations, disappearances. Most Praetorians were not actively looking for trouble. They were just soldiers doing their job. But some of them enjoyed the power. They enjoyed the fear. They enjoyed knowing that people were careful around them, and some of them used that fear. There were stories of Praetorians who demanded free goods from merchants, who took what they wanted without paying, who threatened anyone who objected. There were stories of Praetorians who harassed citizens, who picked fights, who abused their authority. Most of these stories were probably true. Some were probably exaggerated. But it did not matter. The fear was real. The people of Rome had no recourse. They could not complain to the authorities. The Praetorians were the authorities. They could not appeal to the emperor. The emperor needed the Praetorians more than he needed any individual citizen. So people learned to be careful. They learned to avoid confrontation. They learned to smile and nod and say nothing that might cause problems. This was especially true during times of political instability. When an emperor was weak or unpopular, the Praetorians became more aggressive. They knew the emperor could not afford to punish them. They knew they had leverage. During these times, the streets of Rome felt different, heavier, more oppressive. People stayed home more. They avoided large gatherings. They did not want to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because when the Praetorians were restless, anything could happen. There were moments when the tension broke into open violence. After the assassination of Pertinax, when the Praetorians auctioned the throne, the people of Rome were furious. They rioted. They threw stones at the Praetorian camp. They shouted insults. The Praetorians responded with force. They charged into the crowds. They beat people. They arrested dozens. The riots were suppressed. Order was restored. But the anger remained. The people of Rome hated the Praetorians. They resented their privileges. They resented their power. They resented the fact that these men, who did nothing but stand around the city, earned more than soldiers who actually fought. But hatred without power is just frustration. And the people had no power. The Senate had no power either. Senators were supposed to be the leaders of Rome. They were supposed to represent the people. They were supposed to have authority. But the Praetorians did not answer to the Senate. They answered to the emperor, and if the emperor was weak, they answered to no one. Senators learned to be careful around Praetorians. They learned not to offend them. They learned that a Praetorian prefect could be more powerful than any senator. Some senators tried to cultivate relationships with the Praetorians. They invited them to dinners. They gave them gifts. They tried to win their favor. Other senators avoided them entirely. They stayed in their villas. They kept their heads down. They waited for things to change. But things did not change. Not really. The Praetorians remained. They remained powerful. They remained feared. And the fear shaped how people lived. Parents warned their children to be respectful around Praetorians. Merchants trained their employees to be polite. Tavern owners made sure their establishments stayed quiet when guards were present. It became second nature, a habit, a survival skill. But it also created resentment. Deep, quiet resentment that had no outlet. The people of Rome remembered when things had been different, when the city had been a republic, when power had been shared, when soldiers had stayed in their camps and did not interfere in civilian life. Those days were long gone, but the memory remained, and that memory made the present harder to bear. The Praetorians were a constant reminder that Rome was no longer what it had been, that the republic was dead, that power came from swords, not votes. This was the psychological weight of the Praetorian presence. It was not just about physical danger, it was about what they represented. They represented the end of something, the end of an ideal, the end of the belief that Rome was governed by laws and traditions. Now Rome was governed by whoever controlled the Praetorians, and the Praetorians controlled themselves. There were moments of hope. Moments when it seemed like things might change. When Severus disbanded the old Praetorian Guard after the auction of 193 CE, people celebrated. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought the new emperor would restore order. But Severus just created a new Praetorian Guard. Different men, same system. And within a few years, the new Praetorians were acting just like the old ones, because the problem was not the individual soldiers. The problem was the institution. The problem was having armed men in the capital with the power to make or break emperors. As long as that existed, the fear would exist too. The people of Rome learned to live with it. They adapted. They found ways to navigate the danger. They learned the unwritten rules. Do not insult the emperor where Praetorians can hear. Do not gather in large groups. Do not draw attention to yourself. Do not resist if a Praetorian makes a demand. These rules were never written down. They did not need to be. Everyone knew them, and everyone followed them, because the alternative was too dangerous. The Praetorians were not monsters. Most of them were ordinary men. They had families. They had friends. They laughed and drank and told stories like anyone else. But they also had power. And power, even in the hands of ordinary men, can be frightening. especially when that power is unchecked. When there is no one to appeal to, when the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you fear most. This was life in Rome under the shadow of the Praetorian Guard. It was not constant terror. It was not open tyranny. It was something more subtle, more pervasive. It was the knowledge that at any moment things could go wrong, that a careless word could lead to trouble, that the men in armor were not your protectors. They were your masters, and you had no choice but to accept it. Because in Rome, the Praetorians had won. They had taken power. They had made themselves essential. And the people, the Senate, even the emperors, had to live with the consequences. The fear in the streets of Rome was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, constant, inescapable. It was the fear of knowing that the guards had become the rulers, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Some emperors understood the problem. They saw what the Praetorian Guard had become. They saw the danger. They knew that as long as the guards held so much power, no emperor was truly safe. So they tried to fix it. They tried reforms. They tried reorganization. They tried replacing commanders. They tried reducing privileges. Most of them failed, because the Praetorians did not want to be controlled. They had tasted power. They had learned what they could do, and they were not willing to give that up. Augustus, the first emperor, had created the guard carefully. He had kept them scattered. He had kept them small. He had made sure they answered only to him. But Augustus had advantages that later emperors did not have. He was the founder. He had ended the civil wars. He had brought peace. People needed him. His successors did not have that same authority. Tiberius, who came after Augustus, tried to maintain control. He was careful with the Praetorians. He paid them well. He honored them. But he also made a mistake. He allowed his Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, to build the Castra Praetoria, a permanent camp, a unified base. This gave the Praetorians strength. It gave them identity. It made them harder to control. Tiberius realized this too late. Sejanus used his position to accumulate power. He isolated the emperor. He controlled access. He made himself indispensable. Eventually, Tiberius had to act. He had Sejanus arrested and executed, but the damage was done. The precedent was set. A Praetorian prefect could become too powerful, and an emperor who was not careful could lose control. Claudius, who became emperor after Caligula's assassination, understood this. He knew the Praetorians had killed his predecessor. He knew they had chosen him. So he tried to manage them carefully. He paid them generously. He gave them the donative they expected. He made sure they had no reason to turn on him. It worked. Claudius died of natural causes, or possibly poison, but not at the hands of his guards. But his approach was not a solution. It was just appeasement. He had bought peace, not control. Nero tried a different approach. He appointed prefects he thought he could trust. He gave the Praetorians privileges. He tried to make them dependent on him. But when the legions turned against him, the Praetorians abandoned him. All his gifts, all his payments, all his careful management meant nothing. The Praetorians had learned they could survive without him. They had learned they could find another emperor. So they did. Vespasian, who became emperor after the chaos of 69 CE, was more practical. He was a military man. He understood soldiers. He knew you could not control them through fear alone, so he paid them well. He treated them with respect. He made sure they were satisfied, and he made sure his sons, Titus and Domitian, did the same. The Flavian dynasty lasted nearly 30 years. The Praetorians remained loyal throughout. Not because they loved the Flavians, but because the Flavians kept them happy. But this was still not control. It was just successful management. Domitian, the last Flavian emperor, grew paranoid near the end of his reign. He stopped trusting people. He started seeing conspiracies everywhere. He was right to be paranoid. There were conspiracies. And when he was assassinated in 96 CE, the Praetorians did nothing to stop it. They had decided he was more trouble than he was worth. After Domitian came a series of emperors who tried different approaches. Nerva tried to be conciliatory. He tried to work with the Praetorians. He tried to give them what they wanted. They pushed him around. They made demands. They forced him to hand over the men who had killed Domitian. Nerva had no control. He was emperor in name only. Trajan, who came next, had more success. He was a military commander. He was respected by the legions. The Praetorians did not challenge him. But Trajan's control came from his personal authority, not from any structural reform. When he died, the problem remained. Hadrian, Trajan's successor, tried to be careful. He executed 4 senators who he believed were plotting against him. He wanted to send a message that he would not tolerate threats, but he also made sure to keep the Praetorians satisfied. He paid them. He honored them. He did not try to reduce their power. This became the pattern. Emperors who were strong and respected could manage the Praetorians. Emperors who were weak or unpopular could not. But none of them could truly control the Guard. None of them could eliminate the threat. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, understood this. He was one of the most capable rulers Rome ever had. He was intelligent. He was disciplined. He was respected. But even he could not reform the Praetorians. He paid them. He kept them loyal. He made sure they had no reason to turn on him. And when he died, he left the throne to his son, Commodus. Commodus was everything Marcus Aurelius was not. He was arrogant. He was cruel. He was unstable. The Praetorians tolerated him for a while, but eventually they decided he had to go. They were part of the conspiracy that killed him. And, once again, they proved that no emperor was safe if the guards wanted him gone. Septimius Severus, who became emperor after the auction of 193 CE, tried the most dramatic reform. He disbanded the entire Praetorian Guard. He sent them away. He replaced them with soldiers from his own legions. It seemed like a real solution. It seemed like he had broken the cycle. But he had not. The new Praetorians were different men, but they were still Praetorians. They still had the same role. They still had the same access to power. And, over time, they learned the same lessons the old guards had learned. Severus's son, Caracalla, kept the new Praetorians loyal by paying them enormous sums. He raised their pay significantly. He gave them bonuses. Constantly. He bought their loyalty, just like emperors had always done. When Caracalla was assassinated in 217 CE, the Praetorian prefect Macrinus was behind it. Macrinus then declared himself emperor. He was the first Praetorian prefect to take the throne directly. This was the ultimate proof that the reforms had failed. The Praetorians were still kingmakers. They were still the real power in Rome. Macrinus did not last long. He was defeated by the legions and killed. But the precedent was set. A Praetorian prefect could become emperor. The guards were not just influencing succession, they were part of it. Throughout the 3rd century, emperors continued to struggle with the Praetorians. Some tried to reduce their power. Some tried to replace them. Some tried to buy their loyalty. None of it worked for long. The fundamental problem remained. The emperor needed guards. Those guards had to be strong enough to protect him. But if they were strong enough to protect him, they were also strong enough to threaten him. There was no way out of this paradox. An emperor who tried to weaken the Praetorians made himself vulnerable to other threats. An emperor who kept them strong made himself vulnerable to them. Some emperors tried to balance this by creating rival forces. They expanded the imperial bodyguard. They brought in foreign troops. They tried to divide the military power in Rome. But this just created more factions, more groups competing for influence, more instability. The Praetorians remained the most important force because they were in Rome, because they had tradition, because they knew how the system worked. By the late 3rd century, the situation had become absurd. Emperors were being made and unmade constantly. The Praetorians supported whoever paid them. The throne changed hands every few years. It was chaos, but it was predictable chaos. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone knew how the game was played. The emperors who survived were the ones who accepted reality, who paid the Praetorians, who did not try to fight them, who worked within the system rather than against it. The emperors who tried to reform the guard, who tried to reduce their power, who tried to assert real control, they did not last. Because the Praetorians had won. They had become too powerful to be controlled, too essential to be eliminated, too dangerous to be challenged. The emperors had created them, had given them power, had taught them that loyalty could be bought, and now they had to live with the consequences, or die with them. For nearly 300 years, the Praetorian Guard had been part of Rome. They had protected emperors. They had killed emperors. They had sold the throne. They had shaped the fate of the empire. But nothing lasts forever. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was changing. It was fragmenting. The old certainties were breaking down. There were multiple emperors now. The empire had been divided into eastern and western halves. Different men ruled different regions. They fought each other for supremacy. The Praetorians remained in Rome. They still guarded whoever controlled the city. They still expected their pay. They still believed they were essential. But the world was moving on without them. In 306 CE, Constantine became one of several claimants to the imperial throne. He was the son of an emperor. He had support from the legions in Britain and Gaul. He was ambitious. He was capable. He was ruthless. And he understood that the Praetorian Guard was a problem. Constantine had seen what the Praetorians did. He had seen how they manipulated emperors, how they sold their loyalty, how they created instability. He knew that as long as they existed, no emperor could truly rule Rome. But Constantine was not in Rome. He was in the north, fighting other claimants to the throne. The Praetorians were far away. They were not his immediate concern. In Rome, the Praetorians supported a different emperor, Maxentius. He was the son of a former emperor. He controlled Italy. He had the support of the Senate and the people of Rome, and he had the Praetorian Guard. Maxentius paid them well. He gave them privileges. He relied on them to maintain his power in the city. The Praetorians were loyal to him, or at least they were loyal to his money. For several years, Constantine and Maxentius were rivals. They controlled different parts of the empire. They built up their forces. They prepared for the inevitable conflict. In 312 CE, Constantine marched on Rome. He brought his legions south through Italy. He defeated Maxentius's forces in several battles. He moved closer to the city. Maxentius prepared to defend Rome. He had the walls. He had supplies. He had the Praetorian Guard. But Constantine had something else. He had momentum. He had experienced soldiers. He had confidence. The two armies met at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome. It was a decisive battle. Constantine's forces were disciplined and well led. Maxentius's forces, including the Praetorians, fought hard, but they were outmaneuvered. The battle turned into a rout. Maxentius's army broke. Soldiers fled toward the bridge. In the chaos, the bridge collapsed. Hundreds of men fell into the Tiber River. Maxentius was among them. He drowned in the river, weighed down by his armor. The Praetorians who survived the battle retreated into Rome. They locked themselves in their camp, the Castra Praetoria. They prepared to defend it. But Constantine did not attack. Immediately, he entered Rome as a conqueror. He was welcomed by the Senate. He was proclaimed emperor. And then he dealt with the Praetorians. He did not negotiate. He did not offer them terms. He did not try to win them over. He simply disbanded them. Constantine issued an order. The Praetorian Guard was dissolved, permanently. The Castra Praetoria was to be demolished. The Praetorians were to be scattered throughout the empire, assigned to regular legions on the frontiers. There was no auction this time, no negotiation, no chance for the Praetorians to find another emperor to support. Constantine had won, and he did not need them. The Praetorians protested. They argued that they were essential, that Rome needed them, that emperors had always needed them. Constantine disagreed. He had his own guards, the Scholae Palatinae, elite units drawn from across the empire. They were loyal to him personally. They had fought for him. They had proven themselves in battle. He did not need the Praetorians, and he did not want them. The dissolution was carried out quickly. The Praetorians were stripped of their rank and privileges. Their camp was torn down. The stones were scattered. The site was left empty. Some Praetorians were reassigned to frontier legions. They went from being elite guards in Rome to being ordinary soldiers in distant provinces. It was a humiliation. Others were simply dismissed. They were given small pensions and sent away. They had to find new lives as civilians. A few resisted. They refused to accept the dissolution. They tried to organize. They tried to find support. They were arrested. Some were executed. The rest were exiled. Constantine made it clear that there would be no second chances. The Praetorian Guard was finished, and this time it was permanent. Constantine moved the capital of the empire to the east, to a city he renamed Constantinople. He built a new palace there. He created new institutions. He started fresh. Rome remained important, but it was no longer the center of power. The emperor was no longer there. The government was no longer there. And without the emperor, there was no need for the Praetorian Guard. The dissolution of the Guard was not just about Constantine's personal preference. It was about a fundamental shift in how the empire was governed. The old system, where the emperor lived in Rome and relied on the Praetorians for protection, was broken. It had created instability. It had led to assassinations and civil wars. It had weakened the empire. Constantine's new system was different. The emperor was mobile. He had multiple capitals. He relied on field armies, not urban guards. He did not concentrate power in one place where it could be captured or corrupted. This made the empire more stable, at least for a while. The Praetorians had been a symptom of a larger problem. the problem of having too much power concentrated in one city, too much dependence on one group of soldiers, too much vulnerability. Constantine solved that problem by dispersing power, by moving away from Rome, by creating a new model of imperial rule. The Praetorian Guard could not exist in that new model. They were too tied to the old ways, too tied to Rome, too tied to the idea that the emperor needed them, so they were eliminated. It was not dramatic. There was no final battle, no last stand, no heroic resistance. The Praetorians simply ceased to exist. Their camp was demolished. Their name was erased. Their legacy was buried. For a few decades, people in Rome remembered them. Old men told stories about the days when the Praetorians had ruled the city, when they had made and unmade emperors, when they had been the most powerful force in the empire. But those stories faded. New generations grew up who had never seen a Praetorian, who did not remember what they had been. Rome itself declined. The city that had once been the center of the world became just another provincial capital. The Senate lost its power. The old families faded away, and the Praetorian Guard became a memory, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when guards become more powerful than the people they are supposed to protect. Historians would write about them. They would analyze what went wrong. They would debate whether the Praetorians were a necessary evil or a fundamental mistake. But the Praetorians themselves were gone. Their barracks were ruins. Their traditions were forgotten. Their power was broken. Constantine had succeeded where so many emperors had failed. He had eliminated the Praetorian Guard, not by reforming them, not by replacing them, but by making them irrelevant. He had changed the empire in a way that made them unnecessary, and once they were unnecessary, they could be removed. It was a lesson that would echo through history. Power that seems permanent can disappear overnight. Institutions that seem essential can become obsolete. Guards who seem invincible can be disbanded with a single order. The Praetorian Guard had lasted for nearly 3 centuries. They had shaped the history of Rome. They had influenced the fate of emperors and the direction of the empire. But in the end, they were just men. Men with swords and armor and privileges. Men who had been given power and had used it badly. And when their time was over, they vanished. Completely, permanently. The Castra Praetoria, their fortress in Rome, was torn down. The stones were used for other buildings. The site was forgotten. Today, if you visit Rome, you can find traces of where it once stood. Fragments of wall, pieces of foundation, archaeological remnants. But the Praetorian Guard itself is gone, lost to time, remembered only in books and stories. They had been the guards who became kingmakers, the protectors who became threats, the servants who became masters, and in the end, they learned what all tyrants eventually learn. Power that is taken can be taken away. The story of the Praetorian Guard is not really about soldiers. It is about power, about how it shifts, about how it corrupts, about how the people meant to serve can become the ones who rule. The Praetorians began with a simple purpose: protect the emperor, keep him safe, stand watch while he slept. But somewhere along the way, something changed. They realized they were essential. They realized the emperor needed them more than they needed him. They realized that the swords they carried could be used for more than just defense. And once they realized that, everything else followed. The bonuses, the privileges, the interference in politics, the assassinations, the auction of the throne. Each step seemed logical at the time. Each step was just a small extension of what had come before. But together, those steps led somewhere dark. They led to a place where emperors were afraid of their own guards, where the throne could be bought and sold, where loyalty meant nothing and money meant everything. The Praetorians were not uniquely evil. They were not monsters. They were just men who had been given power and had learned to use it. The real problem was the system, the structure that put armed men in the capital. That made them essential to the emperor's survival. That gave them access and influence and the ability to make or break reigns. That system was flawed from the beginning. Augustus created it because he needed protection, but in creating it, he planted the seeds of instability that would plague Rome for centuries. Every emperor after him had to deal with the consequences. They had to pay the Praetorians. They had to keep them happy. They had to live with the knowledge that the men guarding their door might be the ones who killed them. Some emperors managed this well. They were strong enough, or clever enough, or generous enough to keep the Praetorians loyal. Others were not so fortunate. The Praetorians killed Caligula. They abandoned Nero. They murdered Galba. They sold the throne after killing Pertinax. They were part of conspiracies against Commodus and Domitian and others. They shaped the history of Rome in ways that no one had intended, in ways that no one wanted. But they could not be stopped, not by reforms, not by replacements, not by anything except the complete transformation of the empire itself. Constantine understood this. He did not try to fix the Praetorian Guard. He eliminated them. He changed the empire in a way that made them unnecessary. And once they were unnecessary, they disappeared. The lesson here is not simple. It is not just about military power or political corruption. It is about something deeper. It is about what happens when the people you depend on realize they have power over you. It is about what happens when protection becomes control. It is about what happens when the guards stop guarding and start ruling. These patterns repeat throughout history, in different places, in different forms. But the underlying dynamic is the same. Power concentrates. Those who hold it want more. Those who depend on it become vulnerable. The Praetorian Guard is just one example, but it is a clear one, a stark one, a reminder that even the most powerful empire in the world could be held hostage by 9,000 men with swords. Rome survived the Praetorians. The empire continued after they were gone. But it was never quite the same. The instability they created, the civil wars they enabled, the emperors they killed, all of this weakened Rome. It made the empire more fragile. It made it harder to govern. By the time Constantine disbanded the Guard, the damage had been done. Rome was already in decline. The Praetorians were not the only cause, but they were part of it. They were a symptom of a system that had stopped working. A system where power came from force, not legitimacy. Where loyalty could be bought. Where the throne was just another prize to be won. That system could not last. And it did not. The Praetorian Guard is gone now. Their camp is ruins. Their name is history. Their power is dust. But the questions they raise remain. How do you protect power without creating a threat to it? How do you trust the people you depend on? How do you prevent guards from becoming masters? These are not easy questions. They do not have simple answers. But they are worth thinking about. Quietly. Carefully. In the stillness of the night. Because the story of the Praetorian Guard is not just ancient history. It is a pattern. A warning, a reminder. Power that is given can be taken. Protection can become control. Guards can become kings. And once that transformation begins, it is very hard to stop. The Praetorians learned this. The emperors learned this. Rome learned this. And now, 2,000 years later, we can learn it too. Not through drama or excitement, not through grand conclusions or moral lessons, just through the quiet understanding that comes from looking at the past and seeing what it has to teach us. The Praetorian Guard stood watch for nearly 300 years. They protected emperors. They killed emperors. They shaped the fate of Rome. And then they were gone. Their story is over. But the echoes remain, in the ruins of their camp, in the pages of history books, in the quiet knowledge that power once given is hard to take back. This is what the Praetorian Guard left behind. Not monuments or glory, just a lesson. A lesson about what happens when the guards realize they are more powerful than the emperor. A lesson about what happens when protection becomes a threat. A lesson about power that was never meant to rule. And with that, we can rest. The story is told. The history is laid out. The Praetorians have had their moment. Now there is only silence, and sleep, and the long, quiet passage of time. Good night.